Hello everyone. Today me and my group will talk to you about Peter Pan. So let's start with domestic order versus romantic fantasy. So let's start in the nursery, in a very proper Victorian home. This slide shows us the two parents and they could not be more different. First, we have George Darling. He's the model of a strict, anxious Victorian father. Everything about him is about control and appearances. He's worried about what the neighbors think, and he even turns fatherhood into a kind of math problem, calculating the cost of raising his children like a business expense. He represents order, logic, and social pressure. Then we have Mary Darling. She's the opposite. Her mind is described as full of little mysterious boxes, one inside the other, each one hiding a secret. And inside her is a kiss that no one can ever fully reach. Not her husband, not even someone as powerful as Napoleon. This kiss is a symbol. It represents something private and romantic in her that stays hidden. That logic cannot be touched. So, this slide sets up the central tension of the story. Strict, control reality on one side, and hidden, romantic imagination on the other. That tension is what makes the story of Peter Pan possible. Now, this is the moment where that tension breaks open. The nursery window on the third floor is not just a window, it's a threshold, a doorway between two worlds, the strict Victorian world we just talked about, and the total freedom of Neverland. When Peter Pan comes through this window, notice how he's described. He's compared to Mrs. Darling Hidden Kiss, the same secret, romantic thing we just mentioned. And he's dressed in skeleton leaves, which gives him this wild, natural, almost otherworldly look. So this window is the moment fantasy physically breaks into reality. It's the crack in the film of the ordinary world, and through that crack, the children and the audience step into the unconscious. Finally, we arrive in Neverland itself. And the idea of, this slide here is that Neverland isn't just a fantasy setting, it's actually a map of the mind, especially a child's mind, right before sleep. Three parts of this island stand out. First, the island itself is described as nicely crammed, small but packed full of adventures. This mirrors how a child's imagination works, dense, vivid, with dangerous and wonderful things sitting right next to each other. Second, the lost boys. These are children who fell out of their prams and were never claimed. They know their parents didn't want them. They live underground in a kind of regression and they desperately long for a mother figure to care for them. They represent abandonment and that deep wish to be nurtured. And third, the thread of time. This is represented by Captain Hook and the crocodile that haunts him, with a clock ticking inside his stomach. Hook and the crocodile represent two sides of adulthood, and that ticking clock is a constant reminder that time never stops, and that growing up and eventually dying, it's unavoidable. So this gives you a natural flow from the tension between order and fantasy to the window as the breaking point, and finally into Neverland as a symbol of the unconscious mind. Thank you.
Okay, hello, my name is Diana, and we are going to look at a deeper literary analysis of Peter Pan. because we usually think of this story as a simple children's fairy tale. However, Barry's work actually includes complex psychological and social themes. So let's start with our first slide. It's called The Performance of Motherhood. As we see how strict Victorians' gender roles appear even in the magical world of Neverland, of course. Peter Pan convinces Wendy to fly away with him by saying that one girl is more use than 20 boys. And he says this because he thinks girls are naturally smarter and responsible, but when Wendy arrives in Neverland, she doesn't get to be a free adventurer. She's confined to the underground home, and she immediately becomes the imperial mother for the lost boys. So this shows us that in this story, a girl cannot escape traditional female roles, even in a world of fantasy. So we continue with, sorry, okay, we continue with the second slide. Focuses on the darker side of Peter Pan because we see Peter's famous quote, that is, to die will be an awfully big adventure. This sounds very brave, but literally analysis shows as a true because Peter is fearlessness comes from a scary type of amnesia or memory loss, probably, because Peter cannot keep deep emotional connections. He quickly forgets the enemies he killed, and over time, he even forgets Wendy herself. So while Peter enjoys absolutely freedom, his life is also a tragedy, I think, because by refusing to grow up, he is completely isolated and unable to truly love. But we continue with my final slide, that is dualities or the double identities of the three main male characters, of course. First, we have Peter Pan. In his actions, he is an innocent, brave, and heroic leader, but psychologically, he is self centered and deeply terrified of adult responsibilities and real emotions. So, the second is Captain Hook. On the outside, he is ruthless. He is a blood bloodthirsty pirate, but in reality, he is painfully lonely and terrified. And he is also obsessed with good form, which means upper class British manners. And finally, we have George Darlings. We look at Wendy's father. In the home, he acts like a stern, powerful boss, but inside, he is very insecure. He is constantly wants praise from his family and later out of wild he sheepishly crawls into the dog kennel, and these characters show that the story is a deep psychological study of the fears of growing up and the pressures of society, of course. This is all, but thank you for your time and your attention. We continue with Jose.
This chart title shows how the capacity to fly or childhood imagination decreases as we grow up. In early childhood represented by Michael, this belief is at its highest with 95%, but is dropped significantly during the schooling years and maturation to 60% and 35% until it reaches a minimum of only 5% in adulthood. The main takeaway here is that growing up, developing logic and accepting societal norms directly leads to the loss of childhood magic. Well, this timeline illustrates the generation and repetitive nature of motherhood in the story. It follows chronological, starting with Wendy Darling moving to her daughter, Jane, then to her grandmother, Margaret, and finally concluding with the concept of the eternal mother. The main takeaway here is that maternal sacrifice is an endless, repeating cycle that passes down from one generation of women to the next. It features a powerful quote that highlights Peter Pan's tragic reality despite experiencing endless magical adventures. He is forever excluded from the simple joy of having a family and mother's love. With this profound reflection, we conclude our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.